In the middle of the Ob River in Siberia lies a forgotten island. Never officially named, it's known after the nearest village, Nazinsky. People who live in this desolate region know the island has another secret name, a name you will never find on Google Maps. While it may not be known, in 1933, it was abruptly chosen to be the site of a new kind of gulag, and dark things took place on this strip of earth surrounded by icy waters. Things that were so horrifying, they were kept hidden for decades. In this video, we'll be doing a deep dive into the heart of human darkness and uncovering the horrors of Joseph Stalin's worst gulag. But before we get into those bone-chilling stories, the troubles in Nazinsky Island began nearly 4 years before this, thousands of kilometers away, during the cold grip of winter in 1929. It was during this time that Joseph Stalin orchestrated a series of events that would ultimately lead to the creation of Cannibal Island. This dark chapter marked yet another horrifying example of the Soviet Union's brutal treatment of its own people. Years after the death of Vladimir Lenin, the exile of Leon Trotsky, and more than a decade after the tumultuous Bolshevik Revolution that toppled the Tsarist regime, Stalin's collectivization marked a bloody period in Soviet history. The idea was for peasants in places like Ukraine to give up their small farms and join government-run collective farms. This was meant to be the carrot, a way to boost agricultural productivity. But the stick was dekulakization, which involved getting rid of wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, who opposed collectivization. Not surprisingly, many people weren't too thrilled about giving up their land and way of life. In Ukraine, some peasants went to extreme lengths, like destroying their tools, killing their animals, and burning their crops, rather than letting them fall into Soviet hands. Stalin, being Stalin, responded with his usual ruthlessness. Those who resisted were shot, and others were sent to the gulags, the notoriously brutal labor camps. By 1932, collectivization had caused a massive famine throughout the USSR, and the overcrowded gulag system was bursting at the seams. So Stalin needed to find a new solution, and that's where Genrikh Yagoda came in. Yagoda, who would later become head of the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, had a rather twisted idea. He planned to resettle around 2 million dissenters in Siberia and force them to work on collective farms there. He thought it would solve the famine issue and serve as a harsh punishment at the same time. Without waiting for Stalin's approval, Yagoda started rounding up kulaks and sending them off to Siberia, but the process quickly spiraled out of control. Stalin's police force faced quotas, so if they didn't find enough kulaks, they would look for other targets. This led to the persecution of people without internal passports, a system Stalin had brought back. Not having a passport made you a criminal, and since there were always folks without passports in the cities, the police had no trouble meeting their quotas. Take, for example, the story of Kuzma Salnikov, a married miner from Novokuznetsk and a dedicated communist. One day, he went to a market without his identification, and the police closed off the area. Without warning, he was forcibly sent away from his hometown, unable to even tell his wife. He never saw his family again. There was also a 12-year-old girl who was left alone on a train platform for a few minutes while her mother went to buy bread. Across the Soviet Union, hundreds of thousands of people vanished like this. As their families struggled to understand what was happening, those who were captured would be loaded onto trains by Yagoda's men and sent off to the remote areas of Siberia. The journey was so harsh that many died on the way. Those who survived didn't realize it, but they were being sent to a place that resembled hell itself. But did you know that in Siberia, local officials were unaware of the thousands of prisoners headed their way until the first trains arrived? When 25,000 people were unloaded in Tomsk in April 1933, the party leaders were at a loss about what to do next. The problem was that Yagoda's team in Moscow quickly gave the order for repression, but then all the logistics got tangled up in bureaucracy. By May 1933, Tomsk became home to almost 90,000 prisoners, but they hadn't received any money to take care of them. So, the officials decided to shift the problem elsewhere. They loaded the first group of 5,000 exiles and 50 guards onto wooden boats and sent them down the Ob River, headed for a new settlement on an island near Nazino village. The journey was terrible. Nazino was roughly 800 kilometers away, with the river still covered in ice and the region of Siberia battered by snowstorms. By the time the boats arrived at what later became known as Cannibal Island on May 18, 1933, 27 settlers had already died from the cold. The island itself was a small, marshy land, approximately 3 kilometers long and barely 600 meters wide. The settlers were supposed to cut down trees and build huts for shelter, but there was a major oversight by the officials in Tomsk. They forgot to provide the settlers with any tools. As night fell, the settlers found themselves standing on snowy ground, with no means of obtaining lumber to build shelter. With no other options available, they had to sleep out in the open, subjected to the harsh, driving snow. By the time May 19, 1933 arrived, another 295 people had succumbed to the harsh conditions. And so a battle for survival began. Unfortunately, most of the unfortunate individuals sent to Cannibal Island were city dwellers. They lacked the agricultural and survival skills that true kulaks possessed, which quickly became a significant problem. On the barges, the prisoners were given a small amount of bread each day to sustain them. However, the guards soon stopped turning the provided flour into bread. Instead, they simply distributed 200 grams of flour to each prisoner. In their desperation, many settlers mixed the flour with contaminated river water, leading to an outbreak of dysentery. By May 22nd, just 4 days after the arrival of the barges, the prisoners had reached new depths of suffering. Freezing rainstorms claimed lives every night, while those who managed to build fires suffered the tragic fate of burning to death due to their proximity. At this point, the prisoners were still holding on to fragments of their humanity, organizing in protest and starting a riot. The noise attracted the guards, who eventually brought a boat over to investigate. When the prisoners demanded food, the guards agreed to resume the flour rations, but with a condition. Surviving prisoners had to form brigades of 150 individuals and designate a leader responsible for distributing the flour ration. At this moment, any sense of unity on Cannibal Island was lost forever. Among the settlers were a minority of violent criminals and sociopaths who saw the opportunity for their own survival. They presented themselves as brigade leaders to the guards, who simply handed them the flour. And so, the agonizing process of starving to death began for all but a few fortunate prisoners on the island. You may be wondering why people didn't attempt to escape, why they didn't brave the river and make a desperate bid for freedom. The truth is, some did try. Kuzma Salnikov, the communist miner who was arrested at the market, managed to swim across the icy waters to the opposite bank and escape into the wilderness while he still possessed the strength to do so. Miraculously, he eventually stumbled upon a collective farm where he was able to live out the rest of his days. But not everyone was so lucky. In late May, after a week since the arrival of the barges, the camp doctor made a horrifying discovery. He found evidence of cannibalism among the settlers when examining the bodies of deceased prisoners. When he reported this to officials in Tomsk, he was met with the dismissive response that the prisoners were degenerate cannibals by habit. Just 2 days later, another barge arrived, bringing an additional 1,000 prisoners to the island. Did they bring extra food? The answer is no. As June arrived, the starving survivors resorted to the only thing left to them, consuming the bodies of the dead. The first-hand accounts of those who experienced it themselves convey the unimaginable horrors that unfolded. During the chaos in June, a 13-year-old girl from the local Ostyak population happened to be on the island collecting bark. She saw people catch a female prisoner, tie her to a tree, and proceed to mutilate her body, consuming every edible part. This horrifying account is just one example of the depths of depravity reached on Cannibal Island. Soon after, Feofila Belina's parents encountered a woman with her legs wrapped in rags. When they removed the rags, they discovered that her calves had been sliced off for sustenance. The chilling events on Cannibal Island were the result of extreme hunger, sadistic guards, and a lack of oversight. Thankfully, the suffering became so famous that even the Soviets couldn't ignore it. The settlement was abruptly dissolved, prisoners were moved to other farms, and Cannibal Island was abandoned. Tragically, out of the 600-700 people who spent time there, only 2,200 survived. But the story of Cannibal Island isn't over. We still have to confront the aftermath. Vasily Velichko was a communist instructor who lived near the farms along the Ob above Tomsk. When rumors of the catastrophe reached him, he decided to investigate without informing his superiors. When Velichko arrived on Cannibal Island in August, everything seemed normal at first. It was only when he stepped onto the island that he discovered the half-eaten bodies hidden in the grass. Over the following weeks, Velichko interviewed locals and slowly pieced together the horrifying truth. He submitted an 11-page report to Moscow outlining his findings. Unfortunately, he was fired and expelled from the party, and his report was shelved in the state archives. It was thanks in part to the efforts of living witnesses, the Ostyaks, who pushed for a memorial to be erected on the island. It's important to shine a light on this dark chapter of history. So what reparations should the survivors and their descendants get for this horrifying event? Let us know in the comments down below. If you like discussions on important historical topics, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos just like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.